Welcome to a special federal tax credit edition of the Report Card with Nat Malkus. On the Report Card, we evaluate all kinds of ideas, research, policy, and practice that are aimed at improving the lives of families, schools, and students. This week, the Trump administration dropped a big new idea, what they call Education Freedom Scholarships, that is their big play on school choice. Now, many would think that the Trump administration would try a voucher that might be run through the Department of Ed, but that's not what they pitched. They pitched a federal tax credit that would be run through the Treasury, and it would be a tax credit for donations individuals and companies made to state-identified scholarship-granting organizations. Sound complicated? It is. But it's an interesting idea where the federal government could back school choice without causing more problems than it's worth. We brought two people on this special edition podcast to talk about this idea. First, Checker Finn, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Fordham Institute, and also Jim Blue, who's the Assistant Secretary for Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the Department of Education.
Good
Checker,
morning.
Jim, thanks for coming in.
Pleasure.
Good morning.
All right, so first of all, let's get on the board. What is the proposal? It's called Education Freedom Scholarships. Most people don't know more than that. Jim, can you walk us through the rough?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great opportunity. So this is a fresh approach to how we would expand school choice in this country. It is, in its essence, it is merely a federal tax credit that's given when people donate to scholarships for elementary and secondary students. It's a one-for-one tax credit.
Dollar for dollar, you mean one
yes,
for one?
Yes, dollar for dollar. Beyond that, we leave everything else up to the states. So we will allocate the tax credits across the country, and then states get to design their own programs. They can even decide not to participate at all. But they will be able to determine which students would be eligible, which education providers would be eligible, the size of scholarships, all the things that would be better decided at the state level will be done there.
Okay, but I thought this was just going to be a federal voucher program.
It is a fresh approach, so it is not a voucher program at all. In fact, all it is an incentive to contribute to scholarship programs. There's some important implications of that. First of all, the program is completely voluntary. It's voluntary for the donors. It's voluntary for states to participate. And, of course, it's voluntary for families to decide whether to use a scholarship. The other really important aspect of that is that one of the criticisms of voucher programs is that they divert money away from public schools and public school teachers. And, of course, this doesn't do this because everything is funded voluntarily.
Okay, so let's just walk listeners through exactly how this works because, of course, the expectation is there's a voucher program where there's regulations where the federal government would get in. That is not what's happening, and we've never had that. This is a situation where when folks are paying their taxes, if they have made a donation to a scholarship granting organization, then they get a dollar-for-dollar tax credit. So that just comes off their tax bill, their federal tax bill.
Keep in mind, it's not even an Education Department program in the end. It is a Treasury Department, IRS program, if you want to even call it a program, because the only place it turns up in Washington is on your tax return. It is not regulated from the Education Department.
Right. So it's a tax credit. It's not a voucher program or anything of the like. So I get that. And then in the states, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to set this up. So the states have to identify organizations that can receive these monies. These are just viable scholarship granting organizations. So that definitional work, it happens in the states. And then those organizations decide, given the parameters that their states have given them, how to give scholarships for kids to use.
Right, and that's an important point, Nat. While the federal government will not regulate or provide any rules and regulations or accountability provisions, we fully expect the states to do that. In fact, there are 18 programs that exist like this. We've modeled this program somewhat on what they've done. And those programs,
state programs in the
states, state
right.
tax credit programs that also encourage scholarships. And they all, for example, limit the student eligibility to the most vulnerable children, right. Usually students with disabilities or low-income children.
Right.
We're not telling states even to do that much.
Right.
At this point, the proposal simply says we leave it up to the states to hold private schools accountable within their jurisdictions.
And the extent to which the states have flexibility to do what they like with the shape of this program. I mean, this doesn't have to be a private school program either. It can be a program to help kids change public schools or get after-school tutoring. And there's a whole bunch of things states can do within this set of options.
Right. Well, I think that's an interesting part to this. It's not strictly school choice. For instance, if there was a scholarship program for dual enrollment programs, a state could fold that into this. Is that right?
So in our minds, we want to encourage more choice in education. Families are crying out for more opportunities. We, as supporters of education choice, don't really care who provides those options. So these scholarships can be used for public school options as well as private school options. And I imagine there will be states that choose only public school options. And those are, we're leaving it to states to be creative here. Right. If a state has a particular issue with career and technical education, we imagine them doing dual enrollment apprenticeship sort of scholarships. If they have a problem that they want to address in their pre-K population, then they can use scholarships for pre-K.
So this opens it up for pre-K as well. It's not.
It is that sort of depends on the state,
right,
because the state has to define elementary and secondary education on their own.
Right.
And some states have defined it starting at 4 years of age and
right,
going into actually the 14th year
right,
of secondary education.
Wow, that's a totally different conception that most people would have about school choice. If a state could just say, we're going to do pre-K scholarships with this money, that's not the typical picture anyway.
Right. Nor is dual enrollment.
Sure.
Or, one of the other things this could be used for is transportation to another school that is outside of your assigned school.
Gotcha.
So we're leaving it for states to be creative on purpose.
Right.
So we can do experiments. All we want to do is encourage states to provide more choices.
We get so hung up on the phrase school choice as if it had only one meaning. What the administration's proposing is more like educational options within states across the whole span of elementary, secondary education. Part-time, full-time, public, private, after-school, summer school. A lot more potential variability here than is ever associated with the phrase school choice in our conversations.
All right, so to clear up a couple of things for the lay of the land, you had a sort of a event yesterday where the proposals were dropped, but you were joined by Congressman Byrne and Senator Ted Cruz, who have their own sort of proposals. These are all sort of in line, but there's some distinction between them. Can you just kind of lay out the distinction so we know exactly what the Education Freedom Scholarship is?
Sure. Congressman Bradley Byrne's bill is our proposal. He worked very closely with us on developing it, and that is exactly what we've talked about. There's a $5 billion limit on the tax credits, but then we give all the control and freedom to states to design their programs.
And responsibility.
Yes.
Right? I mean, you can say freedom, but it's also the responsibility for them to do this right.
That's the right way to put it. The Cruz bill is identical along those factors. So his bill includes the Education Freedom Scholarship proposal. He has added an extra $5 billion to allow scholarships for adult apprenticeships. Our proposal focused first on the K-12 gap, where there is limited choice right now in this country. And he knows that there's a big demand for more workforce. And so we're very supportive of apprenticeships. We're just not sure that's the right way to do it. So we're withholding our judgment until we see whether – let me pause. One of the reasons that Senator Cruz has included that piece in his bill is because he's hoping that labor will get on board with this proposal.
Right.
And we're watching that closely. We hope that he's right, but we haven't yet seen organized labor embrace this idea.
Okay, well let's stick with the $5 billion empowerment scholarships proposal because that's common across the board. So this has come out, and there's been some reaction. There's been some reaction on the left, been some reaction on the right that's been sort of negative. let's sort of pull that apart. Checker, have you seen some reaction on the right?
Well, yeah. Let's get on the record that if you get negative response from both left and right, you're probably doing something correct.
It's a positive indicator. Right?
Yeah, I think this is a very good sign that you've managed to put out a sort of equal level of displeasure across the political board. In a time of divided politics, I think this feels good to me. Some of my favorite people on the right who pay attention to education, believe in choice, are terribly worried that the federal government is going to basically contaminate anything it touches in the realm of school choice, and it should basically just butt out or stay out. Just about the only thing it does right now in K-12 is, as you know, is a charter school support program, which does run through the education department and is a kind of traditional federal program. Grants go out to states to go to charter schools and things like that. So there's this anxiety on the right that the federal government will overregulate and mess up schools' freedom to be different and so forth.
A fear for which there is no historical basis whatsoever, correct?
There's never been, in my experience, and I've been in aspects of this for about 40 years, a proposal that was quite as intelligently crafted to prevent much federal messing it up. I mean, if federal government was to mess this up, it's going to be because Congress adds the mess, not because this is in what the administration has proposed. And I understand that Congress is totally capable of adding mess. They do it all the time. But that isn't what the administration has proposed. And so I think the fear is, I think a better response from the right would be, let's keep Congress from messing it up and get it enacted. I think that would advance their interests, these folks on the right that believe in educational choices. The stuff from the left is totally predictable. It's people who want to scream, this is a voucher program, even when it isn't, and we hate vouchers, and we're for the administration's going to ruin public education as we know it. The usual complaints from the usual suspects.
Right. As far as the discontent from the right, I mean, first of all, let me just lay this out a little bit more, because I think it's very valid concerns, right? So the first question is, all right, let's just keep it in the sort of conventional school choice realm. We have private schools that don't want to be meddled with by the federal government. We want to keep their independence. We have state programs. We don't want the federal government to kind of glom onto these state programs and then start, grabbing the wheel and start driving things. And those are valid concerns. We've seen, the federal government spends about 10% of K-12 education spending and has really, in the past couple of decades, been able to really grab a lot of control just with that small amount of funding. So these concerns are valid, but sort of my take on this, and I wrote a little piece on this yesterday, was, well, hold on a second. We're missing the fact that I think there's some intelligent design in the bill here expressly put in to keep those things from happening. So let's just review. I mean, Jim, did you foresee these problems and try and avoid them? And exactly, where do you think is the circuit breaker that you've put in that might prevent this kind of federal intrusion?
Well, you have to just take a step back and think about who's developed this bill. We're talking about Ted Cruz, who's one of the country's experts in the 10th Amendment and protecting states' rights to do particularly education activities. And we're talking about Betsy DeVos, who has a strong record of trying to limit the role of the federal government. So we're surprised that some people on the right have this sort of nutty impression that we're going to try and regulate state activities. Right. I think Ted Cruz said it best at the press conference yesterday when he was confronted, like, the Heritage Foundation has come up against this. And Senator Cruz pointed out that he'll put his chops up against the Heritage Foundation any day. So the way we've done that is...
Well, just to put a point on it, so I get that. But I will say, just in sort of sympathy with, the core of the Heritage position is they're not worried about a Republican administration pushing too far. They're worried about what happens in 2, 8, 10 years, whatever, when the next Democratic administration comes in and then says, well, hold on a second, we have to add some things. So my question is there a circuit breaker there that keeps this program somewhat independent?
Well, Of course, there are several, but look, there is always this struggle between state and federal control in education. At this point in our history, it is very clear that it's state control, state and local control. So I can't imagine any time in the near future that there would be such a shift in the tide that everybody would want things run out of Washington, D.C. So there's natural political pushback. We've seen as these programs get established and mature that they collect bipartisan support and that they are protected from those kinds of rules and regulations. So there's a natural dynamic here that would do it. And there is a key a circuit breaker, as you called it. This is all dependent on voluntary donations. And if the federal government got involved and started doing things that made the contribution unappealing, the program would die, would dry up. There would be no more donations to it. And again, I don't foresee any of that happening. I appreciate the paranoia about the federal government's role here. But we can't be fear-mongering about it. We can't be saying that, and they often personalize this. They say, well, what if Elizabeth Warren got elected? She would impose all kinds of horrible things on private schools. And frankly, we haven't seen any evidence of that.
Right.
There's just sort of this specter that somehow these evil things will happen in the future.
This is voluntary on 4 levels. It's voluntary for states. It's voluntary for donors. It's voluntary for schools. Keep in mind, every state that has one of these programs right now has private schools that don't participate because they don't want to be meddled with by their state. And finally, it's voluntary for individual kids and families as to whether to take one of these scholarships. So it seems to me you've got layers of voluntariness. If anybody doesn't like a turn that it takes, they can drop out of it.
Right. Well, one of the things that, sort of I've pushed back on some of the folks on the right for is for not seeing the opportunity that this presents, right? A lot of these tax credit scholarships that currently exist for school choice are, they have one key problem, and that is that they're underfunded, right? I mean, a lot of these programs are less than $3,000 as a scholarship. And that may be a helpful scholarship, but when they're targeted at low-income families, that's just not enough to, give them the real options. In traditional public schools, you got local funding sources, you have state funding sources, and the federal government. The federal government sort of tops off where needed. Certainly seems to me that when the state programs primarily draw on just, about 40, 45, 50% of that the states kick in, again, it's a separate federal source, but it's just that there's no other local or federal revenue stream that can make these work. So I think a great deal of the opportunity is in this proposal is that states that have low funded scholarship amounts, if they use a federal stream to sort of top these off and make them more reasonable, then a lot of the existing scholarship programs and other ones that states might follow and adopt could be strengthened just because you make them more viable. And we've seen evidence that some of these can work. Now, I don't think all school choice programs work. I've been sort of a skeptic, and I've actually sort of crossed swords with Ted Cruz and the administration previously on the 529 thing.
Let me say the 529 thing, as you put it, is how you help your own kid or grandchild to go to a different school.
Right.
You're not allowed under the federal tax credit to help your own child and benefit this way. This is to help other kids, needy kids, or kids the state defines as deserving of this aid. It is not a self-dealing thing like a 529 plan.
Right. Yeah, that certainly is part of the problem with the 529s. The other problem is the 529s, in my view, are just not real functional as a way to deliver more choice to people who currently don't have it. But these tax credit scholarships, they can do that if they're done well. And we've seen out of Florida, the Urban Institute just came out this month, with their review of Florida's largest tax credit scholarship program. And they're showing pretty substantial results with kids. The longer they're in it, the more likely they are to go to college and finish college, which is sort of the holy grail for a lot of these things. I don't think all tax credit scholarships are necessarily as high quality as the one in Florida. There's mixed quality across the states, but that's sort of what you should expect with a program like this, right?
So one of the benefits of having a 50-state experiment is that we can watch how different states will size their scholarships. The scholarships in Florida are larger than the scholarships in, say, Pennsylvania.
Right.
What we expect is that Pennsylvania would augment what they already offer so that consumers have more purchasing power and can seek better options as a result. There is some tie between cost and quality in education. So we imagine that that's going to happen, but we also want to see even more experimentation from both Florida and Pennsylvania to not only up the scholarship amounts in their current states, but to offer different kinds of scholarships. One of the populations that we can be concerned about here at the federal level are military-connected students, and as well as special needs students. And so there's a lot of opportunity to help start meeting the needs of these different populations, and we expect states to do that.
So, Checker,
Yes.
You, and I mean this in the best way possible, have been around for a while. You've seen things come and go. And, so I'll ask a little bit of, is this sort of an unprecedented effort? If so, how? And how would you benchmark its sort of political possibilities for getting onto a change in the tax code?
Well, I personally wish they had come out with it about 18 months ago when Congress was really fussing with a big tax bill. I could easily see this fitting into that a little more easily than as a freestanding bill or waiting for the next big tax bill.
Right.
So I'm not sure that it's got a train to ride on, and I'm not sure it can make it through, especially the new House of Representatives anytime soon as a freestanding measure. I suspect it would get a happier reception in the current Senate and certainly at the White House. So I'm not expecting it to pass this year, at least not through the House Ways and Means Committee. But it's out there for discussion. It's out there for the long haul. I mean, school choice at the federal level, educational choice at the federal level, it is a long haul. It has been a long haul. For me, it's been about a 40-year haul. I mean, I, as a young guy, was a Senate staffer in the late 70s when Senators Packwood and Moynihan tried to enact a federal tuition tax credit to help needy kids go to private schools, mostly in those days Catholic schools. And there was huge interest in saving Catholic schools from dying and saving poor kids and working class kids from losing their Catholic school. It came very close to passing. It passed the House in those days. It narrowly failed in the Senate, but it did fail. President Reagan tried something similar. It didn't go anywhere in Congress. That was in the 80s. There have been repeated efforts to do this, and what's appalling to me is that over this same 40-year period, private everything else has been encouraged by the federal government. Private preschool has been encouraged as umpteen programs to fund options going to preschool. Private colleges have been encouraged. There are umpteen student aid programs, and that's without even getting into private hospitals and private Tesla benefits to get your new energy efficient vehicle.
Right.
I mean, the United States believes in leveraging private dollars and private organizations and private institutions to serve public goods with this unique ghetto of K-12 education, which is not allowed to do that.
Right.
I think that is just anomalous and wrong, and it's been wrong for a long time. And I'm glad to see this reopening as a possibility.
Yeah, I think that there's a wide swath of the public that will line up on either side of this issue. A lot of you can get a lot more salience to push back on this on the left because teachers unions have been driving against these options. So, I'm not here to vilify the teachers unions. I think that they play a vital role. But when I'm looking at what happened in West Virginia this past month, where there was a couple of sort of what they call privatization measures.
Those were charter schools, public charter schools.
That's right, public charter schools, privatization measure. And, all told, these would go into about $8 million maybe in the first year as I ballparked it. And they sunk this bill, even though it provided another 5% raise for all teachers and another $40 million for direct public schools, so a 10-to-1 ratio on investment. And, the union said, no, that's a poison pill. We can't take it because you're ceding any ground to this sort of broad side of privatization. Their words, not mine. Nonetheless, I think that there are ways that this bill may sort of circumvent that to a degree. So let me just imagine for a moment that California wants to expand pre-K, and they do not have a great deal of tax raising capacity at this point. They don't want to raise new taxes, that stuff. This is actually a way for them to get an option at, a couple $100 million for private money that they could also chip in on a match and bring a lot to bear for California pre-K. Again, this doesn't sound like typical school choice, and neither does it seem to, run into this initial opposition that everybody on the left is so keen to bring, which is you're going to privatize our elementary and secondary schools. So I think there's possibilities for this bill that other school choice bills just don't bring to the political table.
So let me acknowledge Checker's point that we're not going to get this done in the next month. Right. We know there's a longer battle here. But we actually believe that enacting this bill is inevitable. And we don't know when that's going to happen, but we do know a few things. One is that the public, the constituents of our members of Congress, are strong supporters of having more choices. Not necessarily private school choice, but some choices beyond their assigned public school. And it's out of their own self-interest. They understand that some of the factory model public schools that still dominate the environment are not serving their kids well. And so they're looking for some opportunities. The other thing we are very realistic about this. There is one very well-funded vested interest that will oppose this. That is the teacher union staff and leadership. And I distinguish them from teachers because we know a lot of teachers would like their students to have more options. They are hugely powerful, particularly in the Democratic Party. And that's why a lot of pundits will say, oh, this doesn't have any chance because the teacher union still controls the Democratic Party, and therefore they're going to stop this. Here's the reality. Democrats often support choice. Maybe not private school choice, but many of them support charter schools, and almost all of them support public school choice, where a student should be able to be transferred to another public school to serve their interest. I believe that over time we're going to build a bipartisan coalition that will say to the teacher unions, we understand you spend $1 billion a year on politics in this country. However, we've got to do what's right for the kids here. And because of that, I think eventually we will win this battle.
So part of that whole storyline is this argument over whether we're protecting public schools or whether we're taking money from public schools and putting them into privates. This setup, which is a federal tax credit, where the money actually never goes to the federal government. I mean, it's a tax credit, so we're taking the money off people's taxes, but the money travels from donors to state scholarship organizations to families to schools. How does this line up as far as protecting public funding? And if someone were to say, oh, that money should be going to public schools, which that's a reasonable argument, but I think there's something in here that is different from the typical way these arguments happen, that the flow of funds is really, these funds would not go to public schools otherwise. Am I right?
You're totally right.
Okay.
Yeah, and it is so contrary to how most people think education should be funded. In education, they say there should be compulsory taxes that should go into one pot of money for a government monopoly to provide education services. So this is a fundamentally different approach to how you would fund education through voluntary contributions and empower families to choose where they go send their children.
Right. And so this tax credit scholarship, yes, I mean, it does reduce tax receipts at the federal level, right? Because we're giving tax credits for it. So I understand that. But any argument that's saying, well, they're taking money from public education with this tax credit would equally apply to whether you're going to buy the next F-22 Raptor or whether you're going to do an infrastructure investment in highways in Nevada, because these are unrelated dollars to public school funding streams.
Totally.
Exactly.
If they're taking money from something, they're taking money from the federal debt in the long run, which is to say, there will be a small reduction in federal revenues, and that's the only money that is involved at the. And there's no reason to believe that was going to go to public schools or public anythings or private anythings. It was just otherwise going to sit in the U.S. Treasury or be rebated to taxpayers in other ways.
So I've written on this sort of general subject before a couple of years ago when Trump had promised we're going to do $20 billion for school choice. I thought, well, that worries me, but, how could it go right? And I've sort of thought about this, but I just want to put a couple of things that I've thought of that I'm like, I'm not so sure about this. And again, as you've said, this is early days. It's a proposal, and the legislative process has a way of, scraping off corners. One of the
adding corners
and adding them, yes, certainly, maybe better at the latter. But one of these that I wonder about is what it takes for a state to sort of engage these. And so, under the Education Freedom Scholarships, it sounds to me, and clarify if I'm wrong here, that the state's role is to set up the design of how scholarship granting organizations will operate in their state, but that it comes short of asking them to have their own tax credit program. In other words, that the state will have a tax credit or partial credit to contributions made in their state. Now, I know the Education Freedom Scholarships is set up to make sure that there's no double dipping. In other words, I give $1,000 to a SGO and I get $1,000 off my federal taxes and $500 off my state taxes. That's prohibited. But my question is, what do states have to do to take advantage of these?
Right. So at a minimum, states must identify SGOs that would be eligible for a tax credit in their jurisdiction. So if you are in New York and you want to make sure that the scholarships can go to students in your state, you need to identify some SGOs that would do that. There are already several private organizations that do this. They're all tax-exempt 501c3, which is one of the requirements in the bill. So that could happen very quickly. We imagine that most states will also take the next step of defining for the SGOs who can receive a scholarship. These privately operating SGOs typically focus on low-income students, and I imagine that many states will simply say, yeah, what you're doing right now, that looks good to us, continue doing it, and then put some other parameters around that. So that's the minimum that states can do. We are also hoping that states will see the benefits of this and add their own tax credits onto it, so that they would also encourage donations above the federal level for people to address their own state liabilities.
Right.
But as you point out, we're very careful in the bill to preempt any what's wonkily called double benefit, right? So you can imagine a scenario where somebody got 100% tax credit for their $1,000 and then also got $1,000 off their state. And that's strictly prohibited.
You would get up to the contribution limits very quickly if that was the setup.
Right, exactly. Instead, what has to happen is if you want to also address your state liability, you have to do that with additional dollars.
Gotcha.
So you'd have to give $2,000
right.
to get the full benefit.
Yeah. But there's no obligation that states match this in any way.
No, not at all.
Totally up to them.
Right. Which could be seen as a value. My perspective on this is that getting states to put skin in the game and have their own tax credit on top of this, so it's more of a piggybacking, does a couple of things. Number one, it just brings interest and makes it go through the legislative process in a more fulsome way because they're actually spending their own money, and that would add to stability in the long term. But it also brings more money into the scholarships so that they can work. And, it builds a constituency in a way that, well, we're allowing federal money to flow in here. So I can understand it on both sides, but I'm sort of pushing on the piggybacking.
So these are all issues we considered very carefully.
Right.
And these are issues where the Secretary in particular had strong feelings.
Right.
This is going to get a little wonky, and I don't want to bore your listeners to death, but the allocation formulas are really important here for actual execution and particularly to address these problems. The first thing that we have done is made sure that no one state can absorb all the money.
Right.
And so we don't usually, as a government, put caps on tax credits. Right. This is really unusual for us to say there's a cap of $5 billion a year. But that allows us to allocate the $5 billion to states. And the mechanism we're using is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act's Title II formula, which distributes the tax credits based mostly on the poverty of the children, but also on just the total number of children.
And so in brief, we already have money that goes out to the states under Title II, and if you're a state, then your share of the $5 billion is equal to your share of Title II money.
Right.
That's the base comparison.
We need to be careful about wording because all we're saying is that voluntary contributions in your state can get up to this cap.
Gotcha.
And when there's a $5 billion cap given the formula, every state will get $25 million at least. That's based on 0.5% of the total. And then the larger states, of course, have larger populations and they tend to have higher levels of students in poverty. And so they'll get massive amounts of money. California and New York, and Texas, the two largest states, each get more than $500 million allocated to them.
Right.
But it's allocated to them that's only realized when donors come forward and say, I want to contribute.
And they're allocating the cap. They're not allocating dollars because they're not giving dollars.
Exactly.
They're giving tax credits, and they're saying you can get tax credits up to this point, and then we can't give out tax credits anymore.
Right. So we have to be careful about our wording there.
Sure.
Once states participate in the program, we then continue to lock in the amount of money. So if Texas, for example, gives out $100 million in scholarships, we want to make sure that the students who receive those scholarships aren't bounced out of school the following year. So once you reach that $100 million cap, you will maintain there.
But again, that's the cap. So the state would have to say, hey, keep contributing, and the SGOs, the scholarship granting organizations would say, we need your donations because we have these kids. So the federal government won't hold them harmless in terms of money, but they will hold them harmless in terms of allocating the cap.
Exactly right.
Okay.
A few years, 5 years into the program, or when the program reaches the $2.5 billion mark, we change the formula slightly to reward states that have skin in the game. So it's a little wonky, but we are indeed doing exactly what you're worried about to make sure that states have an incentive to continue their own tax credit programs to provide scholarships in other ways, including direct appropriations.
Right. So what happens when Nat and I both file our federal tax returns and somebody at the IRS has to say, well, Nat gets this credit and Checker doesn't because Maryland's already reached its cap?
Well, what I'd encourage you to do as a Maryland resident, if they blow out their cap or if they decide not to participate, is to give to an SGO in another state.
Okay.
Because as a federal taxpayer, you're entitled to the credit. You just have to find an eligible SGO somewhere to participate.
It could be in anybody's state.
Exactly.
Aha. It does. My state doesn't even have to have one of these programs.
Right. So if New York, for example, decided not to participate, there are donors in New York we're already aware of who support scholarship programs in New York, but they could also support programs in, say, North Carolina and other places where they have roots.
I think that's an important refinement worth having on the record.
Yeah, it makes a lot of this makes sense to me. I think I can quibble about the details, and that's good. This is the time where you put something out there and we kick the tires on it. And I don't mean we by just the three of us. I mean we very broadly.
The members of Congress might have something to say.
I think you should weigh in.
They don't like tires at all.
But kick the tires on this. And that said, and again, I have friends on the right who have valid concerns about federal intrusion in private school choice. I think that everybody, certainly in here and at the department, is interested in making sure that we walk that tightrope. But I think it's a tightrope worth walking, and I think that this is a good first step in that direction. And I'm looking forward to seeing, how it plays and what the reception is in the future. So, Jim, Checker, thanks for coming on the Report Card.
Happy to do.
Thank
Good
you.
luck with this project.
Thanks for listening to this special edition of the Report Card. And special thanks to our guests, Checker Finn and Jim Blue. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the team of producers and editors here at AEI, including Amy Cummings, Sophia Gallo, Gage Hurley, and Macy Heath. Now, remember, you can subscribe to the Report Card on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast player. And if you enjoy the podcast, please give us a rating on iTunes or Google. It helps others hear about the show. Of course, if you have any comments, questions, or topic suggestions for future episodes, reach out to us at ed.podcast@aei.org. Signing off, I'm Nat Malkus.